Okay, the Massey is back home after its day on the farm doing hay rides during the antique car show. That was the first time I was running the tractor with any sort of load on it, pulling a wagon with people on it. The most people I had on one wagon, I believe, was 20 people, so it was a decent amount of weight with that wagon. I'm not sure the weight on the wagon empty, but it weighs a decent amount. Tractor did fine. It pulled the hills. The motor was working. About halfway through, I noticed on this side of the engine a little bit of oil down in this section here. So I tracked it up, and I wasn't sure if it was coming from the tachometer cable housing because there's a gasket there. It doesn't seem to be there, so I kept going up. And then there's a cover on the back of the head in this area. Thought that maybe was it, but when I had it nice and hot and engine revved up, I was able to actually see right at the head gasket, just bubbling out little bubbles of oil. There's a cam inside here that runs the lifters for the valves, and so there's an oil passageway right in this section here, so I'm sure that's where the oil's coming from, and then it's just getting pushed through here. Now the plan's going to be to remove everything: hood, fuel tank, valve cover. I'm going to check the torque on the head bolts first, because I've read that even if you put a new head gasket on, after so many hours you're supposed to re-torque it. So hoping that this one in this back corner is just a little bit loose, re-torque it. I'll spray a little soapy water on it, check for bubbles, and go from there. So I'm going to set you up on the tripod so you see a little time lapse, and I'll bring you back in when we get it a little bit more taken apart. Okay, here's where we're at so far. We've removed the hood and we got the fuel tank off, so we're starting to get into where we can see the problem better. Next step, I'm gonna fire it up and check with some soapy water to confirm where it's leaking, where we think it is, and then we'll pull the valve cover off and start checking torques. Okay, we just determined that the nuts holding the head down are in fact tight. So not what we wanted to hear. So I guess I will have to be digging deeper into this. I will actually have to pull the head. So more work's ahead. So we decided that there was no time like the present, and we would be pulling this head this day. So what we ended up doing was we divided and conquered. We each just grabbed some tools and started going at it, removing components one at a time. I'm taking the exhaust off. Craig is removing the rocker assembly. We have the radiator drained and the radiator hose loosened up. So we're just kind of going at it one little component at a time, setting everything aside, trying to keep all the nuts and bolts together with the components that they came off with. Okay, right here I'm loosening the bolts that hold the fuel injectors into the head. they're going to actually have to come out too. They were a little bit stuck on there, just some corrosion was holding them in there, so we took a couple pry bars and gently kind of pried up back and forth on either side until they popped out of their little sockets that they're in. So we set them aside so I could clean them up later. And we just keep going here, continuing. We're going to pull, now we're actually going to pull the head, the nuts that were on the head. So I grabbed the bigger impact and zipped all them off. I forget how many there were. There was a bunch of them. So right now we got the head loose, and you can see we're prying it up gently, lifting on it. It was pretty heavy. I'm not sure the exact weight. It was probably about 50 pounds. And we lift that off, and now we can actually see the head gasket and kind of get an idea of what was going on inside the motor. Okay, the head is now removed. The head gasket definitely looked like it was failed in this area over here where it was leaking in this back corner. Interestingly enough, it appears that piston number 1 here must have been changed at some point. There's actually a Perkins part number on this piston, and there's crosshatch on the cylinder walls in this one. The other two definitely look maybe original. They have a 3 and a 5 on one, and I think the other one says D. And the walls, they're not in the best of shape, but it wasn't blowing excessive smoke or anything before. So my initial plan, I'm going to sleep on it, but my initial plan is to clean all the surfaces up, check for flatness on the head, put my new head gasket on, re-bolt it all down, and go from there. Because I don't think I want to do a full engine rebuild at this time, but things might change. I'll keep you posted. Right here I'm going around the head with a fresh razor blade, carefully scraping out all the carbon buildup, and I'm also using some gum cutter with a red Scotch-Brite, kind of buffing it up, cleaning up all the edges. It came out really clean. You know, the head appeared in decent shape, so I just kind of had to do all the scrubbing stuff and get that out of the way, and then I had to move on to the head itself, and it was a lot more of the same, scraping, cleaning, scraping and cleaning, until I got it nice and shiny again. Okay, here's my cylinder head. I started to clean it up, get all the carbon and stuff off of it. I've inspected it over pretty good. There's a few little nicks and dings and stuff, but it's really not bad. I took a precision flat edge and I was checking it for warpage. I couldn't find any warpage. Couldn't see any light under the flat edge. So I think I'm going to skip getting this skimmed right now. It's kind of a gamble. I'd rather just, at this point, it took about an hour to get this far, so I'm going to sacrifice the head gasket, not get this skimmed, just get it cleaned up the best I can, and then reinstall the head gasket and see how it goes. If it fails, it'll be a lesson. It'll cost me another head gasket and another hour of time. So that's kind of where I'm leaning right now. Might change, but that's what I'm thinking so far. I've gotten this water jacket cover plate off. The new gasket kit over here comes with basically every gasket I need, so I have the new one for that. So I'm going to install that on there. Since I have the new gaskets, I figure I might as well. Probably not going to change the exhaust gaskets because they're not leaking, and I don't want to create too much extra work for myself. So that's where we're at so far. I'm going to keep going at it. I'll get this gasket sealed up on there so that has some time to dry, and I'll continue to clean up this a little bit, you know, make sure I get all the carbon off. Same thing on the engine block side, and then we'll be getting the head gasket on and get everything torqued down, see if it stopped leaking. The bolts that were on holding this cover on were kind of corroded, so what I'm doing is I'm running a dye over the bolts themselves, and I'm running a tap in, just cleaning them up. It wasn't really cutting new threads, it was just cleaning out all the junk in there, and then that made for reassembly was much easier. You could just turn them in by hand basically. And then now what I'm using, this is my gasket maker of choice, I guess we'll call it. It's Honda Bond. I like this one, it seems to work good. I find that if you put a little bit on there and then use a little flathead screwdriver to kind of smear it around, keeps it off your fingers, does a good job. You can really kind of, you know, like icing a cake, spread it around nice and easy with a tool rather than your finger. And the cover's going back on, and I snugged them up and then I let it sit overnight, and then I did the final tighten the next day. That's as per the instructions on the Honda Bond. Okay, so now it is the next day. This is our new head gasket, and this is the copper gasket sealant spray. So you put a couple coats, heavy coats on each side, and you let that kind of dry. I'm holding it there, letting it dry off. It'll start getting nice and tacky, and when it's all nice and tacked up, it's ready to install onto your head. So we dripped a little bit of oil onto the cam just so it would be nice and lubricated for when we start this back up. And now we're getting ready to set the head back on, and then we are putting the head nuts all back onto the studs. I'm going to include right here a picture diagram from the shop manual. Basically the sequence: you start from the inside and work your way toward the outside. When you're tightening these, it's to make sure you pull the head down nice and even. Okay, right now we're torquing the head nuts. What I'm doing, it's 55 to 60 foot-pounds is the total. So we are torquing in 20-pound increments. We're going to go over everything once, get it to 20, then we'll go over them again to 40, and then the final one will be 60 foot-pounds. As you can see what he is doing here, he's going in a pattern starting from the center, working his way out just to make sure that everything's tightened evenly. This is basically a reverse of what we did the day before. We have to get the injectors back installed, and there are 2 bolts on each of those, so you got to make sure that we get those nice and clamped down tight. There's a little copper O-ring gasket that goes on there, and the gasket kit did provide new ones of them, so I put them on the injectors. I did clean up the injectors. I didn't get much video of it, but I did get all the carbon and junk off of them, kept them sprayed out. Now I'm going around, I'm putting the radiator hoses back on. There's this little oil line right here that feeds oil I guess it feeds it up into the rocker assembly. So you got to make sure that that's connected before you put the rocker assembly back on, so that will get oil to the top end. And there's the rocker assembly going on now. Okay, here's where we're at now. We've gotten the injectors installed with the new copper gaskets, and we have our rocker assembly back on, filled full of coolant. All the hoses are tight. We've tightened our oil lines here, oil line here that was disconnected, the fuel line, that's all tight. thermostat's tight and resealed. So I believe we are ready to start checking to make sure that we don't need to make any adjustments on the valves. So that's going to be the next step. The service manual that can be found on the internet gives a full description on how to adjust these valves. The gist of what we're doing, basically, we're setting, I'm spinning the motor over, and Craig is watching for the valves to open and close, and he's got feeler gauges, and he's just checking the clearance on them. We actually didn't need to adjust the valves at all. They were all within spec when we were checking them, so that was good and kind of understandable because we didn't really change anything other than the gasket. So the valve cover's going back on, getting the exhaust back on, a couple other little odds and ends we're going to button up here, and then before you know it, we'll be firing this thing up. All right, fuel tank is back on. Everything's bolted up, snugged. We're gonna try to crank it and see if it'll start. Highly unlikely, but we might have to loosen these injectors and bleed them, but we will see. So I'm gonna get ready to fire up now. I'm gonna leave this in real time.
Fuel valve's on, right?
Fuel valve is on. Alright, she runs as good as she looks now. I just ran her up and down the street a bunch of times at high RPM, got the engine to full operating temperature. So far, no leaks. So I think we'll be alright. Gonna have to do some more load testing, pulling some wagons or something to be sure. But for right now, I'm gonna call that fixed. Thanks for watching, guys.